This lecture will define several key terms that are related to sampling that will be at the core of our future discussion of statistics throughout this section. And the lecture will also explain the advantages of sampling over collecting data for the whole population. So why do we sample in the first place? So let's define what populations are and what samples are. A population is a well-defined set of units of analysis. Okay, so imagine that you're conducting a study of Colby students to see how the number of hours spent studying affects cumulative GPA. So your population here would be all Colby students. You'll have to make some judgment calls in defining this population. Are you looking only at current students? Are you looking at students also that have dropped out due to poor performance? So let's say that we decide that we're looking at a population of the classes from 2006 to 2015, since current students are still works in progress, and we will be including those who've dropped out along the way. So that's our population. Next, to come to the sample, we have to use something called a sampling frame. And a sampling frame is the list from which different units are drawn. So this is how we move from the idea of just having that population, of having those Colby students, to actually having a physical list of people that are going to be sampled. So with our example of Colby students, the sampling frame would be the list of all students that we would get from the registrar. So we would have to include those who have dropped out to make sure that that's included in that list. And given that there are approximately 500 students per class that enter Colby, it'll give us a starting point of about 5,000 former students. But actually, you get this list from the registrar and it's smaller. So you see here that the sampling frame is smaller than the actual population. Why is that? Well, if you got a list from the registrar, they might have, you might be missing contact information for certain people. So if you only got the sampling frame of those who we had actual information for, maybe it ends up only being around 4,000 students. Okay, so then you're going to sample from this sampling frame. And so the sample is a subset of the population that's collected systematically using the sampling frame, right? So this is going to be smaller than that sampling frame. We had 4,000 students in that sampling frame, and so then we decided we're going to collect just a portion of that. We're only going to sample 200 former students. Just as a note, we might have to contact more than 200 students because some won't participate. Maybe we won't be able to reach some people, but 200 would be the people who are finally included in your sample. So when you say a sample, it's the people who are finally included in the end that you have been able to reach. So just thinking about how the sample and the sampling frame relate to each other, the sampling frame is the way you get to that sample. The point of sampling is that we can make inferences about the larger population using our sample data. So there are a few key terms to think about here. First, population parameters. And these are characteristics of a population that can be quantified, right? So this would mean, for our example, the actual number of hours a week everybody studied. That would be of all the 5,000 students that are in the total population of Colby students from 2006 to 2015. This would be, what are the real data out there for that entire population? Now, sample statistics would be the estimated value of this population parameter that's calculated using the sample data. So what does this mean? Well, this means that we are not actually measuring the overall population parameter if we're taking a sample. We're only going to be looking at those that we collect, those 200 students that are included in our sample. So using that, we can make estimations about the value for all 5,000 students just from those 200 students. And so this would be, the sample statistic would be the average number of hours studied per week for those in that sample of 200. So let's look at this figure. This shows relationship between the population and the sample. So we have this larger population here, and then you have just a few people who are selected from the sample. So we'll say that people who are black are the ones that have studied more than 20 hours a week, and people who are gray here are ones who are studying less than 20 hours per week. And so we look and we see that the rough population, or the rough percentage of black to gray, is basically comparable between the population and it is for the sample here. And that's because when we can make inferences about our larger population simply based on our sample, that we can use this sample to draw these statistics and then make inferences and say these are maybe not exactly what the values are for the population, but they're pretty close. So why are we sampling in the first place? Why should we be collecting data about the population using a sample? Wouldn't it be better just to collect all that data about the population itself? So why do we do this? Let's compare having a sample with a census. A census would be if you systematically acquired and recorded data about the entire population. You're not going to simply take 200 students out of the 5,000 Colby students. You're going to get data about all 5,000 of them. Versus sampling, where you're systematically acquiring and you're recording data about only a subsection, only that sample of the population. So it seems like getting data on all 5,000 students would be better, right? Wouldn't it really capture all the nuances in the data? You wouldn't have any error that's introduced. You would actually get the accurate information. So why would you sample? So what are some of the advantages of sampling over conducting a census? So first, we are able to make inferences about the population from the sample. They may not be perfect. Our sample statistics are estimates, but they're probably pretty close. And for more on this, you should see the lecture on the law of large numbers. Second, samples are much less expensive to do than censuses, especially as your population is large. The 5,000 Colby students that we're talking about, well, maybe that's not too huge, but if you're talking about doing a study of voters in the United States, if you were to sample all voters in the United States, that is, millions of people that you would have to be contacting. And then, final one that's really interesting, I think, is that sometimes samples are actually more valid than censuses. So this would be the case for the U.S. Census, which gathers data on every single American. The problem is that doing so takes forever, takes several years. And over that time period, sometimes people move around, especially more transient populations. So migrant workers, the homeless, and you end up perhaps leaving them out. If you just did a sample of people who are living in a certain area and conducted it over 2 weeks, you might get a better estimate of what that population actually looks like than if you tried to contact everyone.